I never thought installing a backup propane heater would land me in the middle of a legal battle with people who had nothing better to do than measure the height of mailbox posts. But there I was, staring at a certified letter that threatened me with daily fines if I didn't remove my safety equipment immediately. My name is Derek Rollins, and I had just bought a modest 3-bedroom ranch house in Pinewood Estates, a planned community outside Denver, Colorado. The place seemed perfect when I toured it last spring. The mountains were visible from my back deck. The neighbors seemed friendly enough, and the price was reasonable for the area. What I didn't fully appreciate during those warm May afternoons was just how seriously the homeowners association took their covenants, conditions, and restrictions. I'm an engineer by trade, working remotely for a tech company out of California. I like to be prepared. Call it professional paranoia, but when you spend your days designing backup systems for data centers, you start thinking about redundancy in every aspect of life. So when I moved into my new place in July, one of my first projects was setting up an emergency heating solution. Colorado winters are no joke. I'd lived in the state long enough to remember the blizzards that could knock out power for days. My house had electric baseboard heating, which worked fine when the grid was functioning, but became useless the moment the power went out. So I did what any sensible person would do. I bought a high-quality propane heater setup, the kind designed for emergency use, and installed it in my garage with proper ventilation and all the safety features you could ask for. I even had it inspected by a licensed technician to make sure everything was up to code. The system consisted of a Mr. Heater Big Buddy propane heater connected to a 20-pound propane tank, positioned safely on a concrete pad in my garage with a carbon monoxide detector mounted on the wall. I kept the garage door cracked for ventilation when using it and had a fire extinguisher within arm's reach. I'd done my homework. This setup met all local fire codes and safety regulations. What I hadn't counted on was Patricia Caldwell. Patricia was the president of the Pinewood Estates Homeowners Association, a position she'd held for 6 consecutive years and clearly had no intention of relinquishing. She was a woman in her late 40s with perfectly highlighted blonde hair that never moved in the wind, the kind that required weekly salon appointments to maintain. She wore tennis outfits even though I never saw her near the community courts, and she drove a white Mercedes SUV with vanity plates that read PWD Queen. I first met Patricia properly in early September, though I'd seen her around the neighborhood before. She knocked on my door on a Saturday morning while I was having coffee on my front porch. "Good morning," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "I'm Patricia Caldwell, HOA president. I wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood officially." "Thanks," I said, setting down my coffee mug. "I'm Derek. Been here about 2 months now. Great community you've got." "We like to think so," she replied, glancing around my front yard with an assessing look. "We work very hard to maintain standards. That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. I happened to walk past your house yesterday evening, and I noticed you had your garage door open. I couldn't help but see what appeared to be a propane heater inside. Here we go, I thought. Yeah, that's my emergency backup heating system. Got it all set up in case the power goes out this winter." Patricia's smile tightened. "I see. Well, I'm afraid that's going to be a problem. Our HOA covenants specifically prohibit the storage of flammable materials in quantities exceeding standard barbecue propane tanks, and they must be stored outside the home structure." "It is a standard barbecue tank," I said, keeping my voice level. 20 pounds, same size people use for their grills, and it's in my garage, which is ventilated and has all the proper safety equipment. The covenant states outside the home structure, Patricia repeated. The garage is considered part of the home structure. You'll need to remove it. I felt my jaw tighten. So where exactly am I supposed to store my backup heating source? Outside where it's exposed to the elements and potential theft. Many residents keep their propane tanks on their back decks or patios, Patricia said, as long as they're properly secured and not visible from the street. But the heater itself needs to be inside to actually heat the house, I pointed out. That's kind of the whole point. I understand your concern about winter weather, Patricia said, her tone suggesting she didn't understand at all. But rules are rules. They're in place to protect everyone's property values and ensure safety. I'll need you to remove the setup by the end of the month, or we'll have to begin the fining process. Let me get this straight, I said, standing up from my chair. You want me to remove a safety device that's fully up to code, properly installed, and designed to keep me from freezing if the power goes out, because of an HOA rule. It's not just a rule, it's a covenant, Patricia corrected. You signed the HOA agreement when you purchased your home. You're bound by it legally. I'll look into it, I said, which was the politest way I could think of to end the conversation before I said something I'd regret. Patricia handed me her business card. Please do. I'd hate for this to become an issue. Have a wonderful day. I watched her walk back to her Mercedes and drive off, then went inside and dug out the massive binder of HOA documents I'd been given at closing. I'd skimmed them at the time, mostly focusing on the major stuff like no chain-link fences, no boats or RVs parked in driveways, grass height requirements, that sort of thing. I hadn't paid much attention to the section on flammable materials. After an hour of reading through dense legal language, I found the section Patricia had referenced. Sure enough, it stated that flammable materials in quantities exceeding those typically used for outdoor grilling were prohibited from being stored inside any structure attached to the primary residence. The wording was frustratingly vague about what constituted quantities typically used for outdoor grilling, since my 20-pound tank was exactly what most people used for their grills. I decided to get a professional opinion. My neighbor 2 houses down, Frank Martinez, was a retired fire marshal. I chatted with him a few times while getting my mail, and he seemed like a straight shooter. I walked over that afternoon and found him working in his garden. Hey Frank, I called out. Got a minute? I need some advice. Frank looked up, wiping dirt from his hands. Sure thing, Derek. What's on your mind? I explained the situation with the propane heater and Patricia's ultimatum. Frank listened, his expression growing increasingly annoyed as I talked. That's ridiculous, he said when I finished. Your setup is perfectly safe. I actually noticed it when you had your garage open last week. You've got it positioned correctly, proper ventilation, CO detector, everything by the book. What you're doing is actually smart. I've got a similar setup myself. Really? I said, perking up. Has the HOA given you any trouble about it? Nope, Frank said. Course. I keep my garage door closed most of the time, so maybe Patricia hasn't noticed. But even if she did, she'd have a hell of a time arguing it's a safety hazard when I spent 30 years as a fire marshal. Look, Derek, here's the thing about HOAs. They love to flex their authority, but they're not above the law. State and local fire codes supersede HOA covenants. If your setup meets fire code, which it does, they can't force you to remove it. They can threaten and fine all they want, but if you fight it, you'll win. How much of a fight are we talking about? I asked. Frank shrugged. Depends on how stubborn they are. You might end up having to lawyer up. But I'd be happy to write a statement as a fire safety professional if it comes to that. These HOAs get too big for their britches sometimes. They need to be reminded that safety trumps their aesthetic concerns. I thanked Frank and headed home feeling slightly better, but also aware that I was potentially staring down a protracted battle. I decided to try the reasonable approach first. I drafted a polite but firm letter to the HOA board explaining that my propane heater setup met all applicable fire safety codes and was installed by a licensed professional. I included photos of the installation, the inspection certificate, and a detailed explanation of all the safety features. I cited the specific Colorado Fire Code sections that governed propane heater use and noted that state law superseded HOA covenants in matters of safety. I sent the letter via certified mail and hoped that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 2 weeks later, I received another letter from the HOA. This one was more aggressive in tone. It stated that regardless of fire code compliance, the HOA covenant was clear about flammable material storage, and I was in violation. I had until October 15th to remove the propane heater and tank from my garage, or I would be fined $100 per day until compliance was achieved. $100 per day. I did the math. That would be $3,000 per month. It was clearly designed to force compliance through financial pressure. I called Frank again, and he recommended a lawyer he knew who specialized in HOA disputes. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Susan Kim, reviewed my documents and the HOA covenant during our consultation. "You've got a solid case," she said. "The problem is that fighting it will cost you money upfront, and there's no guarantee you'll recover your legal fees even if you win. HOAs know this, which is why they get away with a lot of overreach. They're betting you'll comply rather than pay me." "What are my options?" I asked. "You can remove the heater and avoid the hassle," Susan said. "You can pay the fines and then sue for reimbursement once they rack up, arguing that the fines are unreasonable and that the covenant is superseded by safety codes. Or you can refuse to pay, let them take you to collections or put a lien on your property and fight it out in court. None of these options are great." I left Susan's office feeling frustrated and angry. This was exactly the kind of bureaucratic nonsense I'd been hoping to avoid. I'd bought a house in a nice neighborhood, followed all the rules that actually mattered for safety and legality, and now I was being harassed over a device that could literally save my life in an emergency. October 15th came and went. I didn't remove the heater. A week later, I received a notice of fine along with an invoice for $700 covering the week I'd been in violation. The notice stated that fines would continue to accumulate daily until I complied. I didn't pay. I also didn't remove the heater. Instead, I started documenting everything meticulously. I took dated photographs of my setup, kept copies of all correspondence, and began researching similar cases. I found several instances where homeowners had successfully challenged HOA overreach when safety was involved, though the process had taken months or years in some cases. November arrived, bringing with it the first real cold snap. Temperatures dropped into the teens at night, and the forecast was calling for a significant winter storm system to move through in mid-November. I tested my propane heater setup to make sure everything was working properly. It performed flawlessly, putting out reliable heat that could keep my garage and adjacent rooms comfortable even without electricity. The storm hit on November 17th. It started as freezing rain in the early morning hours, coating everything in a thick layer of ice. By afternoon, heavy snow began falling and the wind picked up significantly. I worked from home anyway, so I settled in to ride it out. Around 3 in the afternoon, the power went out. At first, I wasn't too concerned. Power outages during storms were common, and the utility company was usually pretty good about getting things back up within a few hours. I lit some candles, pulled out my camping stove to heat some soup for dinner, and wrapped myself in blankets while I read a book on my tablet. The power didn't come back that evening. By midnight, my house was noticeably colder. The temperature inside had dropped to about 55 degrees. I set up my propane heater in the garage, opened the interior door to my house, and let the warm air circulate. Within an hour, the temperature in the adjacent rooms had climbed back to a comfortable 68 degrees. I made sure the carbon monoxide detector was working, kept the garage door cracked for ventilation, and slept soundly. The next morning, the power was still out. I made coffee using my camping stove and checked my phone for updates. The utility company's website showed that over 15,000 customers were without power across the region. Multiple transmission lines were down due to ice accumulation and fallen trees. Estimated restoration time was listed as unknown. I bundled up and ventured outside to assess the damage. The neighborhood looked like a war zone. Tree branches littered every yard, many of them still heavy with ice. Power lines were down on 3 different streets that I could see. A massive cottonwood tree had fallen across the main road leading out of the subdivision, completely blocking it. The snow was still falling, though not as heavily as yesterday. I spotted Frank outside his house, surveying his yard. I walked over, my boots crunching through 8 inches of fresh snow. "Quite a mess," Frank said by way of greeting. "Any word on when power might be back?" I asked. "I talked to a buddy of mine who still works for the fire department," Frank said. "He says it's bad all over the metro area. They're prioritizing hospitals and emergency services first. Residential areas like ours might be waiting a while. Could be 3 or 4 days, maybe longer." "Good thing I've got my illegal propane heater," I said dryly. Frank chuckled. "How's that working out for you?" "Perfectly," I admitted. "Kept my house at a comfortable temperature all night." "You using yours?" "You bet," Frank said. "I'm too old to be sleeping in a freezing house. My wife has some health issues, needs to stay warm. That heater's a lifesaver." We chatted for a few more minutes before heading back to our respective houses. As I walked back, I noticed Patricia Caldwell standing on her front porch, wrapped in what looked like every coat she owned, talking on her phone. Her expression was not happy. Day 3 arrived with no power restoration. The temperature outside had dropped into the single digits, and my neighbors were starting to struggle. I saw several people leaving, presumably to stay with family or friends who had power. The ones who remained were burning fireplaces if they had them, or huddling together in single rooms trying to conserve body heat. My house, thanks to my propane heater, remained comfortable. I was able to work remotely using my laptop's battery and my phone's hotspot. I had food, water, warmth, and even managed to heat water for a decent makeshift shower using my camping stove. I felt prepared and vindicated in my decision to install the backup heating system. On day 4, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find Patricia Caldwell standing there, looking absolutely miserable. Her hair, usually so perfectly styled, was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She wore sweatpants and a puffy jacket, and her face was pale. "Derek," she said, and I could hear her teeth chattering. "I need to talk to you." "Come in," I said, stepping aside. Whatever our disagreement, I wasn't going to leave someone standing in the cold. Patricia stepped into my house and immediately stopped. "It's warm in here," she said, stating the obvious. "Yeah," I said. "That's what happens when you have a backup heating system." She looked at me, and for the first time since I'd met her, her confident superiority was completely gone. She looked scared and exhausted. How do you have heat?" My propane heater, I said. The one you demanded I remove. The one you're fining me $100 a day for keeping. Patricia's face flushed. I didn't think the power would be out this long. How long has the utility company told you? I asked. They're saying at least another week, Patricia said, her voice breaking slightly. There's massive infrastructure damage. They have to rebuild sections of the transmission grid. Derek, my house is 40 degrees inside. I can see my breath. I tried to book a hotel, but everything within 50 miles is completely booked. I can't get out of the neighborhood because of the downed trees blocking the roads. They're working on clearing them, but it's slow going with all the damage across the city. I studied her for a moment. Part of me wanted to tell her this was exactly what she deserved for being so rigid and unreasonable. But I'm not that petty, and leaving someone in a potentially dangerous situation wasn't my style. What do you need, Patricia? I asked. I was wondering, she said, struggling to get the words out. Could I possibly come over during the day, just to warm up? I wouldn't stay long, a couple hours maybe. I'm just so cold. You want to use my illegally installed propane heater that you threatened to fine me thousands of dollars for. I said, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. Patricia looked at the floor. I know I was wrong. I should have listened to you about the safety codes. I was just following the covenant as written. Without applying any common sense, I added. Yes, she admitted quietly. Without applying common sense. Derek, please, I'm asking for help, I sighed. You can come over, stay as long as you need, but we're going to talk about this HOA situation. Okay, Patricia said quickly. Yes, absolutely, thank you. I made her some hot coffee and let her sit near the propane heater in the garage. She wrapped her hands around the mug and just absorbed the warmth for several minutes without speaking. This is a really good setup, she finally said, looking at the heater and all the safety equipment. I didn't realize how sophisticated it was. That's because you didn't bother to look, I said. You saw a propane tank and immediately assumed it was dangerous without considering that I might actually know what I was doing. You're right, Patricia said. I'm sorry. The HOA has become so focused on maintaining property values and enforcing covenants that we've lost sight of why those rules exist in the first place. This heater isn't hurting anyone. It's helping you. It's saving you right now. And it could be helping other people in the neighborhood, I pointed out. But instead, you threatened me with fines to force me to remove it. How many other people in Pinewood Estates might have installed backup heating if they weren't afraid of HOA retaliation? Patricia didn't have an answer for that. She stayed at my house for about 3 hours, warming up and drinking coffee, before heading back to her own cold house bundled in blankets. Day 5 brought more misery to the neighborhood. The temperature dropped to -5 degrees overnight. I heard later that several people had pipes burst from the freezing temperatures. The water to the entire subdivision was shut off as a precautionary measure, which meant no flushing toilets, no running water, nothing. Fortunately, I had prepared for this too. I'd filled my bathtub and several large containers with water before the storm hit, so I had enough for drinking, cooking, and basic sanitation. I also had a good supply of canned food and other non-perishables. Around noon, there was another knock on my door. This time it was a small group of people, maybe 6 or 7 neighbors, including Patricia. They looked like refugees from a disaster movie, wrapped in multiple layers, faces drawn and exhausted. Derek, one of them said, a woman named Linda who lived across the street. Patricia told us you have heat. We were wondering if you might be willing to let some of us come over, just during the coldest parts of the day. We've got young children who are really struggling with the cold. I looked at the group. I recognized most of them from neighborhood gatherings. These were the same people who had presumably supported Patricia and the HOA board's decision to fine me, but I could also see genuine desperation in their faces. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. "Everyone in. Let's get you warmed up." The relief on their faces was palpable. They filed into my house, and I directed them to the garage where the propane heater was running. They gathered around it like it was a campfire, holding out their hands to the warmth. I made coffee and hot chocolate for the kids. I pulled out some snacks from my pantry. These people were cold, tired, and frightened, and whatever frustration I felt about the HOA situation seemed less important than helping them through an emergency. Linda's kids, 2 girls maybe 7 and 9 years old, sat right in front of the heater, their little faces finally losing that pinched, cold look. Linda herself looked close to tears. "Thank you," she said to me. "You have no idea what this means. Our house is so cold. We've all been sleeping in the same bed trying to share body heat. I've been so worried about the girls." "How long can we stay?" another neighbor asked, a man named Robert. "As long as you need," I said. "I've got plenty of propane. This tank will last another week at least, and I've got 2 more tanks stored outside." Patricia, who had been quiet up until now, spoke up. "The HOA fined Derek for having this heater set up. We told him it was illegal and demanded he remove it." The room went silent. Everyone looked at Patricia, then at me. "Are you serious?" Frank said. He joined the group along with his wife, Alina. "You tried to make him get rid of the one thing keeping him safe during this outage." "I was enforcing the covenant," Patricia said defensively, but her voice lacked conviction. "The board voted on it." "The board is you and 2 other people who do whatever you say," Frank shot back. "And now look at us. We're all freezing in our houses while Derek, who had the good sense to prepare, is comfortable, and you tried to punish him for it." "I know," Patricia said, and this time she looked genuinely remorseful. "I know I was wrong. The whole board was wrong. We should have looked at the actual safety factors instead of just blindly following the covenant language." The group stayed at my house for most of the afternoon. As evening approached and the temperature started dropping again, I made a decision. "Look," I said to the group, "anyone who needs to stay tonight can stay. I've got sleeping bags, extra blankets, floor space. It's going to get down to -10 tonight. That's dangerous. I'd rather have a crowded house than have someone get hypothermia or worse." Nearly everyone took me up on the offer. By the time darkness fell, I had 12 people camping out in various rooms of my house, all staying warm thanks to the propane heater that the HOA had demanded I remove. Day 6 was more of the same. The power remained out. The utility company updated their estimate, saying it could be another 4 to 6 days before residential power was restored. The main roads into the subdivision were finally cleared, allowing some people to leave. Several families packed up and headed to stay with relatives in other parts of the state, but many people, especially those who had nowhere else to go, remained. And increasingly, my house became the neighborhood warming center. Word had spread that I had reliable heat, and people started stopping by throughout the day. I did what I could to help everyone, sharing food, water, and warmth. Frank helped me organize things a bit better. We set up a schedule so people knew when they could come over. We created a sign-up sheet for the overnight stays to make sure we didn't exceed the safe capacity of the house. It became a community effort, with people bringing whatever supplies they had to share. On day 7, things took a more serious turn. An elderly resident named Margaret Thompson, who lived alone at the end of the street, was found by a neighbor, severely hypothermic. She'd been too proud to ask for help, and had tried to tough it out in her freezing house. An ambulance came and took her to the hospital. We later learned she would survive but had come very close to dying. That incident shook everyone. Patricia, who had been helping coordinate the warming center efforts at my house, looked absolutely stricken. "This is my fault," she said that evening after Margaret had been taken away. "If we hadn't created this culture of rigid rule enforcement, maybe more people would have prepared like you did, Derek. Maybe Margaret would have felt comfortable asking for help sooner." "This isn't all on you," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed that. "But it should be a wake-up call about how the HOA operates." "I'm going to resign as president," Patricia said suddenly. "After this is over, I'm going to resign and recommend that the board completely overhaul how we handle covenants. We need to prioritize safety and common sense over property values." "That's a start," Frank said. He'd been listening to the conversation. "But what about Derek's fines? He's sitting on over $2,000 in penalties for having the very thing that's saving all our lives right now." Patricia looked at me. "I'll make sure those are waived, all of them, and I'll issue a formal apology on behalf of the board." "I don't want an apology," I said. "I want a guarantee that this kind of thing won't happen again. I want the covenants revised to explicitly allow safety equipment that meets local fire codes. I want it in writing that homeowners can take reasonable measures to protect themselves during emergencies without fear of HOA retaliation." "Done," Patricia said immediately. "I'll draft the amendment myself and put it to a vote of the full membership. After what we've all been through, I can't imagine anyone would oppose it." Day 8 brought some good news. The utility company announced that they'd made significant progress on repairs and expected to have power restored to most areas within 48 hours. The relief was palpable. People were exhausted from the ordeal, desperate for normalcy, but the ordeal wasn't quite over. On day 9, a new problem emerged. With so many people coming and going from my house, with the extended power outage and with the general stress of the situation, tensions started running high. One neighbor, a man named Gary who I'd never particularly liked, started complaining loudly that I shouldn't be hoarding my propane heater while others suffered. This was despite the fact that I'd been sharing my heat and supplies with the entire neighborhood for over a week. Gary wanted me to move the heater to different houses each night so everyone could benefit equally. "That's not practical," I said, trying to stay calm. "Moving the heater risks damaging it or creating safety hazards. The whole system is set up properly in my garage. People are welcome to come here, but I'm not hauling equipment around the neighborhood." "That's selfish," Gary snapped. "You're sitting in your warm house while some of us are freezing." "You're literally standing in my house right now, warming up," I pointed out. "You've been here every day for the past 4 days. How is that me being selfish?" Frank stepped in before the argument could escalate further. "Gary, knock it off. Derek has been more than generous. He doesn't owe any of us anything, but he's been helping everyone anyway. If you don't like the arrangement, you're free to leave." Gary muttered something under his breath but backed down. The incident left a sour taste in my mouth, though. I tried to help my neighbors during a crisis, and some people still found reasons to complain. Day 10 arrived with everyone on edge and exhausted. The novelty of the situation had long since worn off, replaced by a grinding weariness. People wanted their lives back. They wanted hot showers, warm houses, working appliances, and electricity. I was running low on propane by this point. My main tank was nearly empty, and I'd started using one of my backup tanks. I calculated that I had maybe 2 more days of heat if I was conservative with usage. I started limiting the hours the heater ran, keeping it on during the coldest morning hours and then again in the evening. The neighbors who had been staying at my house understood the situation. We all huddled together during the heating hours and wore extra layers when the heater was off to conserve fuel. It wasn't ideal, but we were managing. That afternoon, a utility truck finally appeared in our neighborhood. Workers began the process of restoring power, section by section. I watched from my window as they worked on the lines, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. This ordeal was finally coming to an end. At 4:30 in the afternoon on day 10, exactly 10 days after the initial outage, my power came back on. The sudden hum of my refrigerator, the glow of lights, the whoosh of my heating system kicking on, it all felt surreal after so many days without electricity. A cheer went up from the people gathered in my house. Someone actually started crying. The relief was overwhelming. Within an hour, everyone had headed back to their own homes to enjoy their restored power. I stood alone in my house, suddenly very quiet after days of constant activity and people, and just absorbed the fact that it was over. I'd made it through. My propane heater, the one the HOA had tried so hard to force me to remove, had not only saved me but had helped save dozens of my neighbors. The aftermath of the outage took weeks to fully resolve. There were insurance claims for burst pipes and damaged property. There were bills for emergency services. There was a lot of community organizing to help the most affected residents recover. And then there was the HOA situation. Patricia, true to her word, drafted an amendment to the covenants that explicitly allowed backup power and heating systems that met local fire and safety codes. She presented it at a special HOA meeting 3 weeks after power was restored. The meeting was packed. Nearly every homeowner in Pinewood Estates showed up, which was unusual. HOA meetings typically drew maybe 10 or 15 people. This time there were over 60. Patricia stood at the front of the community center meeting room and addressed the crowd. She looked different than she had before the outage. Less polished, more humble. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "I know we've all been through a difficult experience with the power outage. I want to start by addressing what happened with Derek Rollins and his propane heater." She went on to explain the situation, how she and the board had demanded I remove my safety equipment, how they'd fined me, and how that very equipment had ended up being crucial during the extended outage. "I was wrong," Patricia said bluntly. "The board was wrong. We prioritized rigid adherence to covenant language over common sense and safety. As a result, we penalized someone who had actually prepared responsibly, and we discouraged others from taking similar precautions. That could have had tragic consequences, as we saw with Margaret Thompson's close call." She held up the proposed amendment. "This amendment will explicitly permit backup power and heating systems that meet local safety codes. It will prevent the board from penalizing homeowners for reasonable emergency preparedness measures. I'm recommending we adopt it immediately, and I'm also recommending that we waive all fines that were levied against Derek Rollins." "I second that motion," Frank called out from the audience. The vote was unanimous. The amendment passed, and my fines were waived. There was even a round of applause, which felt surreal. After the meeting, several neighbors came up to thank me again for helping during the outage. Linda, the woman with the 2 young daughters, gave me a tight hug. "You saved us," she said simply. "I don't know what we would have done without your help." Patricia approached me last. "Derek, I know an apology doesn't undo what I put you through, but I am truly sorry. You were right and I was wrong. I let my position go to my head, and I forgot that the whole point of the HOA is supposed to be helping the community, not just enforcing rules for the sake of enforcing rules." "Apology accepted," I said. "Just make sure the next board president remembers this lesson." "About that," Patricia said, "I'm stepping down as president." My term isn't up for another year, but I'm resigning effective next month. I think the HOA needs fresh leadership with a different perspective. Would you consider running for the position? I blinked in surprise. Me? I don't want to be HOA president. You'd be good at it, Patricia said. You're practical, you think about safety, and you actually care about helping people. That's what we need. I'll think about it, I said, though I was already pretty sure my answer was no. I had no desire to spend my evenings dealing with covenant disputes and neighborhood politics. Life slowly returned to normal over the following months. Winter continued its course, bringing more snow but thankfully no more extended power outages. My propane heater sat in my garage, ready for use if needed but mostly idle. Just knowing it was there gave me peace of mind. Frank was elected as the new HOA president in January, running on a platform of common sense leadership and prioritizing safety over aesthetics. He appointed a more diverse board that included a mix of longtime residents and newer homeowners like me. One of their first acts was to create an emergency preparedness committee to help residents plan for future disasters. I joined that committee, figuring I could at least contribute my knowledge without having to deal with the bureaucracy of being on the main board. We put together educational materials about backup power, emergency supplies, winter preparedness, and community support networks. We even organized a neighborhood workshop where I demonstrated my propane heater setup and explained the safety considerations. The response was overwhelming. Within a month, at least a dozen other households in Pinewood Estates had installed similar backup heating systems. Frank made sure that each installation was documented and approved by the HOA in advance, creating a paper trail that protected homeowners from future disputes. In March, I received an unexpected piece of mail. It was a letter from the law firm that represented the HOA. My heart sank, worried that despite everything, there was some new legal issue. But when I opened it, I found something completely different. It was a formal letter of commendation from the HOA board, thanking me for my actions during the power outage and recognizing my contribution to neighborhood safety. It was signed by Frank and the entire board. Attached was a check reimbursing me for the costs of my propane heater setup, including the equipment, installation, and inspection fees. I hadn't asked for reimbursement, hadn't even thought about it. But Frank had apparently pushed for it, arguing that if the HOA was now requiring proper documentation of safety systems, they should help offset the costs for residents who had already done things correctly. I called Frank to thank him. "You didn't have to do this," I said. "Yes, we did," Frank replied. "You spent your own money to prepare responsibly, then got punished for it, and then ended up helping the whole neighborhood. The least we could do was make you whole financially. Consider it a down payment on rebuilding trust between homeowners and the HOA." That summer, the subdivision held its annual community picnic. It was the first major social event since the power outage, and there was a different feeling in the air. People seemed more connected, more appreciative of their neighbors. The crisis had been terrible while it was happening, but it had also brought the community together in unexpected ways. I was manning the grill, cooking burgers and hot dogs, when Patricia approached with her husband and teenage son. She looked relaxed in casual clothes, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, no longer trying to project that image of perfect HOA president authority. "Having fun?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, flipping a row of burgers. "This is nice. Good turnout." "Best one we've had in years," Patricia agreed. "People actually seem happy to be here. Before, these events always felt kind of obligatory. Now it feels different." "Almost freezing together will do that," I said dryly. Patricia laughed. "True." You know, I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about how I operated as HOA president. I was so focused on maintaining standards and property values that I forgot these are people's homes, not just assets to be managed. You taught me that lesson, even though I fought it at the time. For what it's worth, I get why HOAs exist, I said. Nobody wants the neighbor who paints their house neon purple or leaves a rusted car on blocks in their front yard. But there's got to be a balance between maintaining community standards and allowing people to live their lives without constant scrutiny. That's exactly what Frank is trying to do, Patricia said. And it's working. Did you hear the Henderson complaint got resolved last week? I hadn't heard, so Patricia filled me in. Apparently, one of the residents had wanted to install solar panels on their roof, which technically violated the covenant language about roof modifications. The old board, Patricia's board, would have automatically denied it. But Frank's board had looked at the actual impact, considered the environmental and financial benefits, and approved it with some reasonable aesthetic guidelines to ensure it didn't look terrible from the street. That's the kind of decision-making we should have been doing all along, Patricia said. Evaluate each situation on its merits instead of just defaulting to no, because that's what the covenant says. As summer turned to fall, I found myself more involved in neighborhood activities than I'd ever intended to be. I helped organize a community emergency drill. I volunteered to review other residents' backup power plans. I even attended most HOA meetings, though I still refused to run for the board. September brought another milestone. Margaret Thompson, the elderly woman who had been hospitalized for hypothermia during the power outage, invited several of us over for dinner. She'd made a full recovery and wanted to thank the people who had helped her. It was a small gathering. Me, Frank and his wife, Patricia, Linda and her family, and a few others. Margaret, spry and energetic despite being in her 80s, served a magnificent roast chicken dinner. I learned something important during that awful experience, Margaret said when we were all seated. I learned that pride can be dangerous. I was too stubborn to ask for help, too concerned about being a burden. I almost died because of it. But I also learned that this community, when push comes to shove, takes care of its own. Derek opened his home to everyone, not because he had to, but because it was the right thing to do. That's the kind of neighborhood I want to live in. She raised her glass. To Derek, and to learning from our mistakes. Everyone raised their glasses, and I felt my face flush with embarrassment. I just did what anyone would do, I mumbled. No, Frank said. You did what anyone should do, but what many people wouldn't. You prepared, you stood your ground when you were being treated unfairly, and then you helped everyone anyway even though you had every right to be angry. That's character. The first anniversary of the power outage came in mid-November. The neighborhood had changed significantly in that year. The covenant had been amended in multiple ways to reflect the lessons learned. The HOA board operated more transparently and collaboratively. Residents felt more empowered to question decisions and propose changes. Property values, despite Patricia's old fears, had actually increased because people wanted to live in a community that had proven it could handle a crisis. I was sitting on my front porch on a cold Saturday morning, drinking coffee and watching the neighborhood wake up when Frank walked over. "Big day coming up," he said, settling into the chair next to me. "What's that?" I asked. "Election day for the HOA board," Frank said. "My term is up. I'm running again, but we need 2 more board members. You sure you won't reconsider?" "I'm sure," I said. "I'm happy to help with specific projects, but I don't want the responsibility of running the HOA." Frank nodded. "Fair enough. You've done more than your share already. But I wanted you to know that people respect you around here. You've got social capital if you ever want to use it." "I'll keep that in mind," I said. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the neighborhood. Kids were playing in a yard down the street. Someone was raking leaves. A couple was walking their dog. Normal, everyday suburban life. You know what the funny thing is, I said eventually. When I bought this house, I was just looking for a quiet place to live and work remotely. I didn't want drama or community involvement. I just wanted to be left alone. And instead you became the neighborhood hero, Frank said with a grin. Not a hero, I corrected. Just a guy who bought a propane heater. Everything else kind of spiraled from there. That's how it happens sometimes, Frank said. You make one reasonable decision, someone overreacts, and suddenly you're in the middle of something bigger. The question is what you do when that happens. You could have just removed the heater and avoided the hassle, but you stood up for what was right, and it made a difference. I thought about that after Frank left. He was right, in a way. I could have taken the path of least resistance, given in to Patricia's demands, and avoided the whole conflict. But then what would have happened during that power outage? I would have been just as cold and miserable as everyone else. And more importantly, I wouldn't have been able to help my neighbors when they needed it most. Sometimes the difficult path, the one that involves standing up to unreasonable rules and dealing with conflict, is the right path. Not because you're looking for trouble, but because you know you're right and you're willing to defend that position. The propane heater still sits in my garage, properly maintained and ready for use if needed. It's become something of a neighborhood legend. New residents moving into Pinewood Estates often hear the story about the power outage and the HOA president who tried to ban the very thing that saved everyone. It's told as a cautionary tale about the dangers of rigid rule enforcement without common sense. I kept the certified letters from Patricia, the notices of fine, all the documentation from that fight, not because I hold a grudge, but because it's a reminder. A reminder that rules should serve people, not the other way around. A reminder that preparation matters. A reminder that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when it's inconvenient. Last winter was mild. We had snow, but nothing like that devastating storm. The power stayed on throughout the season. My propane heater sat unused, which was fine with me. It's the kind of thing you hope you never need, but are grateful to have just in case. I did end up using it once, though, not for an emergency, but for a neighborhood event. In February, Frank organized a winter camping night in the community park. Families set up tents and spent the night outside, teaching kids about cold weather survival and emergency preparedness. I brought my propane heater to the main gathering area, and we used it as a warming station where people could rotate through to thaw out. It was actually pretty fun. Kids roasted marshmallows, adults told stories, and everyone learned something about staying safe in winter conditions. The heater that had caused so much controversy became an educational tool and a community asset. Patricia showed up to the camping night with her family. She'd become much more low-key since stepping down as HOA president, no longer trying to control everything, just participating as a regular resident. Her son, a teenager named Tyler, was fascinated by the propane heater setup. "This is really cool," Tyler said, examining the safety equipment and ventilation system. "Did you design this yourself?" "I researched different options and put together what worked best for my situation," I explained. "The key is following safety protocols. You always want proper ventilation, carbon monoxide detection, and fire suppression equipment nearby. And you need to understand the basics of propane combustion and heat distribution." Tyler listened intently, asking smart questions. "I want to study engineering in college," he said. "Stuff like this, practical problem solving, that's what interests me." "Then you're on the right track," I told him. Engineering is all about identifying problems and designing solutions. Sometimes the problems are complex technical challenges. Sometimes they're as simple as staying warm when the power goes out, but the thought process is the same. Patricia watched us talk with an expression I couldn't quite read. Later, when Tyler had wandered off to join his friends, she approached me. "Thank you for encouraging him," she said. "He's been struggling to figure out what he wants to do with his life. Seeing how you handled the whole heater situation, how you stood your ground and then helped everyone, it made an impression on him. He talks about you sometimes, how you knew you were right and didn't back down even when authority figures were pressuring you." "I hope I'm a good role model," I said, slightly uncomfortable with the idea that a teenage kid was looking up to me. "You are," Patricia assured me. "You showed him that standing up for what's right isn't about being confrontational or difficult. It's about knowing your facts, following proper procedures, and having the courage to defend reasonable positions even when it's uncomfortable. Those are good lessons." As I sit here now, looking back on everything that happened, I realize how much one seemingly simple decision changed my life and my relationship with this community. Buying and installing that propane heater was just practical preparation to me. I never imagined it would lead to conflict with the HOA, then vindication during a crisis, then becoming an unexpected voice for common sense governance in the neighborhood. I learned some things too. I learned that HOAs aren't inherently bad, they're just organizations run by people, and people can make mistakes. When Patricia was rigidly enforcing covenants without considering context, she wasn't trying to be malicious. She genuinely believed she was protecting property values and maintaining community standards. She was wrong, but her intentions weren't evil. And when faced with undeniable evidence that her approach was flawed, she had the integrity to admit it and change. I learned that community matters more than I thought it did. I moved to Pinewood Estates thinking I just wanted privacy and a nice house. I didn't expect to care about my neighbors or want to be involved in local governance. But when crisis hit, when people needed help, I discovered that I did care. I cared a lot. And that sense of community, of being part of something larger than myself, has enriched my life in ways I didn't anticipate. Most importantly, I learned that preparation isn't paranoia. When people first heard I was installing a backup heating system, some of them probably thought I was being overly cautious or paranoid about unlikely scenarios. But unlikely doesn't mean impossible. That power outage did happen. It lasted 10 days. And everyone who thought it could never happen to them learned otherwise. Now, when I check my propane tanks, test my heater, and maintain my emergency supplies, I don't feel like I'm being paranoid. I feel responsible. I feel prepared. And I know that if another crisis hits, I'll be ready not just for myself, but to help my neighbors too. The propane heater sits in my garage right now, clean and maintained, waiting for the next emergency that hopefully never comes. But if it does, I'll be ready. And thanks to the changes we made to the HOA covenants, dozens of other families in Pinewood Estates will be ready too. That's the real victory that came out of this whole situation. Not that I won my fight with the HOA, but that we created a safer, better prepared community as a result. And Patricia, despite everything, became a friend. We have coffee sometimes, talk about neighborhood issues, laugh about how ridiculous that whole fight seems in retrospect. She's actually a decent person who got too caught up in her role and lost perspective. When faced with reality, she adjusted her views and made amends. That takes character. So yeah, my HOA tried to ban my propane heater setup, threatened me with thousands of dollars in fines, and made my life difficult for months. Then a 10-day power outage hit, and suddenly that banned heater was the most valuable asset in the neighborhood. The people who threatened me ended up depending on me for survival, and instead of telling them to freeze, I helped them, because that's what neighbors do. The story could have ended with bitterness and division. Instead, it ended with positive change, stronger community bonds, and better policies that will protect everyone for years to come. Not a bad outcome for what started as a simple decision to buy some emergency heating equipment. Looking back, I wouldn't change anything. The conflict was frustrating and stressful while it was happening, but it led to important conversations about how we govern ourselves and treat each other. Sometimes, you need a crisis to reveal the flaws in a system. That power outage was our crisis, and we came out better for it. My advice to anyone dealing with an unreasonable HOA is simple. Know your rights, follow proper procedures, document everything, stand your ground when you're in the right, but also leave room for people to learn and change. Patricia did something wrong, but she eventually made it right. That's all you can ask for. And always, always prepare for emergencies. You never know when the power will go out, when a storm will hit, when you'll need that backup plan you hoped you'd never use. Being prepared isn't about being afraid. It's about being responsible. It's about taking care of yourself and being ready to help others when they need it. That propane heater cost me maybe $400 all in. It saved me and my neighbors during a 10-day crisis. It changed how our HOA operates. It brought a community together. Best $400 I ever spent, even counting all the stress and conflict that came with it. So the next time someone tells you that preparing for emergencies is unnecessary or paranoid, or that following common sense safety measures violates some arbitrary rule, remember this story. Remember that rules should serve people, not control them. Remember that being prepared is smart, not paranoid. And remember that sometimes standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, leads to outcomes that benefit everyone. That's my story about how my HOA banned my propane heater setup, then panicked when a power outage lasted 10 days. It's a story about preparation, conflict, community, and ultimately about how people can learn and grow from difficult experiences. And it all started with one simple decision to buy backup heating equipment, and refuse to remove it when unreasonable people demanded compliance with an unreasonable interpretation of a rule. I'm still here in Pinewood Estates, still have my propane heater, still involved in the community in ways I never expected. Life is unpredictable like that. You make one decision, stand by it, and end up somewhere completely different than you planned. But sometimes different is better. In this case, it definitely was.